Thank you for joining us for another episode of Awake and Empowered TV. I'm Ethann Fox, and I'm here with Micheila Sheldan again today. And this is our new podcast format where we discuss different topics in a more spiritual, consciousness-oriented context in a free-form format. There may be some channeling involved, or even conscious channeling, but for the most part, this is going to be just the two of us having conversation, as we often do have conversations when we're together, and we thought this would be an opportunity for us to share that interaction and the kind of thoughts and ideas we throw around just in everyday discussions. So today we were going to talk about relationships and in the spiritual context, and share some of our information, knowledge, experience, as well as channeled information on that topic. So did you want to start with that, or at least as far as from guidance or anything that you've...
So many different directions we can go with relationships, and what I guess I'll start out saying is, I recently filmed a channeling for my Inner Circle subscription-based group, and it was somewhat like a tell-all from the guides about upcoming themes for 2023, and they were really putting a spotlight on relationships. And these are not just romantic relationships, but relationships of all kinds, because I think over the last couple of years, a lot of the things that are going on planet Earth have kind of wreaked havoc on these relationships, and we really need to now kind of brush away all the debris and reveal what's there and what's working and what's not, and do some repair work.
Well, one of the things I've been noticing in the spiritual community and the world as a whole, of course, I mean, we're going to see this emphasized even more on the global landscape in more mainstream conversations, and that is that our society is sort of moving away from harmonious relationships and through a lot of programming and conditioning around masculine and feminine roles. And this has really been going on for a long time, I think, especially since the early 1970s. A lot of things that in many of our shows, we're going to discuss a lot of the events and cycles and things that brought us here. But to a great extent, I do find that there was a significant ramping up of a lot of these things that we're now seeing exploding on the global landscape that started back in the 1970s. And which is interesting because Micheila and I were born in the late 60s. So we, in many respects, in our entire lifetimes, we've experienced and witnessed firsthand this degradation of society to where we are today. And so a lot of the themes that exist today that have moved us away from harmonious relationships and the strong family unit and children who value their parents and look to them for guidance versus the state, those things really escalated in the 1970s. And what I'm seeing today is it's become so pervasive that it's even very prominent in the spiritual conversation and spiritual communities, where I think we've been conditioned to such a degree that we've even lost touch with what divine feminine and divine masculine are, to the extent that I see a lot of men, for example, who have become very feminine, and I think for men, the strength and the power is in the masculinity. It's not in the femininity. And for women, I see so many women in society and even in the spiritual community who have become very masculine, or even varying degrees of masculine, meanwhile talking about the divine feminine in a masculine way. So I think one of the things that we have to do as a society is we have to move in some ways back to the way we were, but not quite the way we were, because it wasn't exactly ideal then either. But from a higher consciousness perspective, we have to realize that the real strength in our physiology comes from the femininity or the masculinity, meaning men have to express their masculinity in a more conscious way, and women have to express their femininity in a more conscious way, which means that women are going to be more feminine and are going to be more nurturing and men are going to be more the masculine energy and more of that strength type of energy, which creates harmony in that union between two people. So one of the main things that I think we have to do as a society is move back toward that. And in that context, one of the other things that I see, and it's really escalated in the last few years, of course, and I think it's only going to increase in this decade ahead, is that so many families have become splintered and friend circles and so on. I mean, even many of you watching this show today had friends in the spiritual community over the last few years that completely disintegrated because people chose sides and everybody went to one extreme or another. And we have to understand that there is a global movement by many of the world leaders and so on to splinter our society by splintering our friend and family circles, so that ultimately, if you don't have family and you don't have friends, then all you have is a state. And if you go to the state to be your parents, then the state has full control over you. And this is, I mean, there are many reasons why these ideas and these agendas are being orchestrated on the global society, but that is one of the big parts of it. And the more we move toward men becoming more feminine and women becoming more masculine, the farther away we are going to get from that harmony. Now, one thing that I want to talk about and that I hear a lot in especially the spiritual community is, many of us have lost our families and our friends, especially in the last few years, and I see a lot of people really struggling with that they can't really go to their family gatherings or holidays and be themselves or discuss topics that don't match the consciousness or the interests of that particular group. And I would challenge all of you to that, first of all, this is just the way it's going to be for a while, because everybody is going to evolve and come to an awareness at a different pace. And some of the people in your family and friend circles may never reach that level to where they can sit and have a conversation with you and relate to you one-on-one. So what we need to do in the interim is we need to form families and friends among those around us who are on a similar wavelength. That may mean that you have a spiritual member in one of your spiritual groups, like Micheila's inner circle group, and maybe that person is another part of the world. And for the holidays, maybe you get together with them and a bunch of your other spiritual friends, and you all get together and have Thanksgiving or Christmas or whatever holidays you celebrate as a family that may not be biological in nature, but maybe spiritual in nature. And that's a way to sort of bridge this gap while we are going through this transition. And many of our families may not make that transition with us at any point in this life. And that's perfectly all right. But I think for us to go back to where we have strong societies and strong families and strong children and strong relationships ultimately as well, we have to work from where we are. And where we are is our spiritual family and those who relate to us are all over the world. They were not people we were born with in many cases. And so, but they're just as valid as an opportunity. So I encourage you to reach out to each other and start thinking of each other as biological family members. And when holidays and other gatherings come up, those may be the people you go to visit and have gatherings with. And in that way, I think we can start repairing a lot of the damage that's happened in our society as we moved away from that family unit and that, friend unit. Back when we were kids, it was still somewhat intact because a lot of that disintegration really started happening in the 70s and 80s, and we didn't know or realize that it was happening until it got to this point in the last decade or so where all of those agendas accelerated and amplified to such a degree now that we're seeing extreme cases of these things, like nowadays with all of the transgender movement and all of the discouragement around masculinity in the US. Now, if you're watching this from overseas, this may not be so much of a situation in your country, But in the US, white American males have been vilified in the recent few years, and especially men in general, or the idea of testosterone being a toxin in the body or toxic masculinity. All of these propaganda ideas are being proliferated in society in order to remove the masculinity of men and make them more feminine. And in so doing, well, if you don't have a society of masculine men, then again, it's easier for the state to control the people. If men are not men and don't stand up for society and stand up for their families and stand up for the women that they are responsible for, then it's easy for the state to control everybody. And then you have children who don't have fathers who are very strong and can guide them and give them that moral foundation to live a good life and be good people. So this is one of the biggest issues that I see in society, and I think we can't expect that this is going to be fixed on the macro level, because governments have no interest in having stronger people and stronger families. They want the opposite. So we can't expect this to be repaired on the mainstream level. We have to repair this on our own personal level, in our own personal relationships and families. And in doing that, we can start building stronger and stronger generations and families and relationships going forward. So that's been my observation. What have you been finding?
Yeah, absolutely. I agree with that. Of course, the guides are always bringing these concepts in very different terms and in different ways. But I wanted to comment on what you said about family. And one of the things in the book, I've channeled a book. If you're not familiar, you can check it out on my website, free of charge. One of the things they say is that souls who are often very evolved or ascended or come here with really big things to do will choose families that they have nothing in common with or have a really hard time getting along with, or there's trauma there, because if those bonds and responsibilities were that close, it would be really hard for them to go out into the world and embrace the human collective as their family, which is what I think a lot of the people who tune in to our work are actually doing. They're out there being of service, and they're creating new products and communities and things like that. Not to say we can't have a family and do that, but I think in a lot of instances, we are moving away from that kind of traditional and more conventional set of responsibilities and applying them in a bigger way onto the world. But you were mentioning, the elite and, the guides actually talk about reptilian consciousness, and that we have reptilian consciousness, and that manifests through a group of people, right, who are doing certain things on our planet. And what I think is truly brilliant here is it's a time of war on planet Earth. So we talk about this a lot in my channeling. The spiral of time comes back around, and we have all these timelines kind of intersecting and crescendoing all at the same time. They're historic in nature. But what reptilian consciousness has done, it's moved into the more enlightened communities and in spiritual, I'd say, realizations about dealing with trauma, and taken that to the extreme where instead of actually doing things that will benefit, these lineages and traumas and, things that have gone on in the past have been so wrong, placing blame or pointing fingers. And I think that's where a lot of this imbalance in masculine and feminine is truly coming from, toxic masculinity. We're never going to move away from traumas in the past, men against women or vice versa, if we're pointing fingers. That just perpetuates the energy. So the war that causes the trauma continues on in a new way. And we were just having a conversation actually before we started the camera about this whole idea of trauma and this cycle of repeating karma that we've been in the third dimension. And really, in order to kind of move beyond that, it's not the dimension itself that's so bad. It's not, we often do this, we kind of condemn and, damn the third dimension and the people that are there that are so unconscious. But actually, when we become victim to this subconscious programming and, all the stuff that the propaganda, right, that's being put out there, we can easily spiral in these new ideas that we think are going to solve the issue that are actually at the same vibrational playing field or level of the problem that was created long, long ago. So it's kind of like keeping us in this stagnant place that we never move above and out of.
Yeah, I think we also have to be conscious of what sorts of things we're ingesting. And I'm not talking about the food we eat, although certainly those are important factors as well. And it really in our society, I'm speaking of the United States in particular, other countries, in some cases are much worse and some are better. But certainly from a dietary perspective, there are things in our water and our environment here that are bringing testosterone levels a lot lower. I mean, men in the United States have significantly lower testosterone than in many other countries, and yet this, in theory, should be the healthiest country. But in reality, actually, the United States healthcare system is significantly down the charts in terms of being among the highest or the best in the world. So certainly there are dietary and environmental factors to consider as well. I think, for example, one of the first things I would do from a purely health standpoint, but also psychologically as well, is filtering your water, for example. And because most municipal water systems in the U.S., unless you're getting some sort of spring water or something, you have groundwater in your area, contains pharmaceuticals and all kinds of other toxins that are also affecting your physiology and psychology. But I want to talk specifically about television and movie programming, which these days, and I've gone back and looked at shows from the 80s and 90s, for example, and you can see the slow progression toward what we see today, where now almost everything you watch on any network, whether it be Netflix or whatever it happens to be, and most of the movies that are coming out these days are almost entirely propaganda based. It's not really about entertainment and enjoyment anymore, but there's so much, and a lot of it can be very subtle to where we become somewhat desensitized to it, and we're not realizing that these views that are being portrayed in these shows that we're watching are becoming part of our normal perception of what reality should be. So I think a lot of the destruction that's happened in relationships is because we've changed our beliefs through psychological programming as well. That's happened through things that we watch or people we follow on social media and so on, which so many of them nowadays are working to further these various agendas to split apart families and relationships. So you have to be really conscious of what kinds of information you're ingesting and digesting, as much as the food and the water as well. But I think that's an area where a lot of us don't pay attention because it's, you may sit on the sofa and turn on the show and just sort of zone out and you don't really think about what you're watching. But you have to really pay attention to the themes that are being shared in those. And I'm a little bit encouraged though, because on the mainstream level, I am seeing over the last couple of years a significant amount of people are starting to see all of the programming and messaging that's in the shows they're watching, and so a lot of those movies and shows are not getting as much interest, and parents aren't taking their kids to watch the children's shows that have so much propaganda and psychological manipulation built into them, which is not good for their health. It's not good for their psychological well-being and their future relationships. So I think the trend may be starting to change as a result of how extreme it's become in recent years. But but I think it's an important thing that we have to pay attention to. So when you're watching something, or whether it be a TV show or a movie or whatever, be conscious of what you're watching while you're enjoying whatever you're watching, so that you are acknowledging what is actually being shown to you. And if it goes against your views or against what you think how healthy life should be, then those are ideas that you should question in your mind and not allow to become a permanent part of your psyche. So I think that's a really important factor too.
Yeah, I totally agree. And this is an age of transparency, and it's pretty obvious, to apply that transparency these days to things like mainstream media and movies and Netflix. But I still think our blind spot as a human collective is social media, because that is what has so prominently come up as the programmable, constant that we have going on in the background of our lives. And even future generations, and you and I have come up without social media, and now we're on the other side of it, but future generations have been immersed constantly. And I notice that in my own children. So it is easy to see social media as real life, and easy to get really taken by that. So in the masculine and feminine balance, one of the things I notice in my session work with people is that they feel very confused about what direction to take their lives and what actually authentically brings them joy and what they're here to do. And I think the reason for this is because social media has taken us so far off track. There's just so much information to look at, but it's also very masculine driven, even hidden under the guise of feminine success, making money, attaining something spiritually, having the best relationship, or even being alone and being able to conquer the world by yourself. These are all these kind of, I think, materialistic and egoic ideals that are hidden by the guise of spirituality and these, fancy videos of waterfalls and, yoga retreats that I think are great. Obviously, you and I are very into metaphysics and all of this stuff. But I think we have to be careful, even when we're going that direction, as to what we're tuning into and how it's influencing us and carrying us away from what we know to be true and what we are here to experience, which is completely different than anyone else.
Yeah, I don't think it's so much about the money itself as much as it is the when money becomes a pursuit itself, as opposed to doing something that you enjoy doing or that you're really good at, and you just happen to make money doing that thing. So I don't think that there's any problem with being very wealthy or being very poor. The money itself is meaningless. It's just a way that energy moves in through the universe. And what in the spiritual community especially, we tend to vilify money, and then we see the opposite side where people are very money oriented, so it can go both ways. But I think it really needs to be more of a neutral thing, something that we don't really think about. I often use breathing as an example. We inhale and we exhale air. We don't really judge it or think about it. It's just something that naturally happens in the background. And the same way, money should be treated as well. It's just something that we take in and we give out whenever we need to. And of its own, it should have no consequence. But the one thing about money that makes it a little bit different is that it is controlled by a handful of people in the world, and that's what makes it a little different from breathing. Although, I've been sort of attributing lately the whole global warming, climate change agenda that's been going around, which is tied very closely to carbon taxes and carbon credits and so on. And I've often thought, well, at some point, and you channeled over the last couple of years about how water was going to become an issue on the planet, and we've noticed that water now is traded on the in this I think in the commodities exchange. So now water has become financialized, and as a result, it's going to become more and more controlled. Like in Michigan, where we live, there are a lot of lakes, and we have a lot of groundwater. Yet many corporations now own the rights to the water. But when you think about something like that, that's such a basic fundamental need for us to exist. It's being controlled by a handful of people, and they dictate what it costs and so on. Well, when that happened, I thought, well, the next thing they'll control is air, and the thing is, like, that's also happened too with carbon tax and so on, which ultimately is going to be a tax on breathing and essentially the production of carbon dioxide. So the problem with money, and these are all topics for another day, but the problem with money is not really the money; it's just an energy flow. And if it wasn't currency in the form of dollars or whatever your currency happens to be, it would be in the form of shells or gold or something else or cryptocurrency. It's going to take some shape or another. Because we now live in a globalized society, we can't really barter for things, because if you want to buy a television, for example, from somebody in China who manufactures it, well, you can't barter with something that you own because they don't necessarily need that. So bartering, while it's nice in principle, it's not really practical. But what I want to touch on that Micheila mentioned about money and masculinity and social media and these things is if we use the Chinese culture as a model, China 100 years ago was a very spiritual place, and the people took care of each other. Their families were very close knit. They had different kinds of spiritual beliefs. They were a much more peaceful, kind, and generous society. And then the communism took over I believe, in the 1920s. And since then, society has moved toward more financialization. And so now people there have lost all of that. They've lost their spiritual beliefs. The few that actually have it are punished or vilified by the government. And what happens is you have a society now there of people who don't care about each other. They abuse each other, they're mean to each other. They are very much driven toward money and wealth and flaunting your wealth. And I think in the United States, we're heading in that direction, especially with what's happened in the recent couple of decades, is we are moving even more and more toward a very financially driven society where what we make in money and the glamorous things and lifestyles that we have are what's more important than having fundamental spiritual or values toward kindness and taking care of each other. And that, I think, is a very concerning trend, because if we don't turn that around globally, and especially in the US, and China has a lot farther to backtrack to get back to where they were, then we will end up in a society that becomes more corrupted and more, a lot less kind and a lot less spiritually oriented. And we're seeing that trend really picking up in steam right now.
Yeah, just to play off the whole money discussion, something the guides have really been focused on in my work lately is this idea that we come to the earth already in possession energetically of everything we need to live the life that we are meant to have. And sometimes people get really frustrated when they hear this because they think, well, if I'm going to go broke, then I'm meant to be broke and there's nothing I can do to change it. But in ancient civilizations, what they would do in relationship is combine the masculine and feminine energies in practices like Tantra and things like this. And it was not with the intent of making money. So we talked in our last video about manifestation and law of attraction and all of these things. And I think the difference between those ancient cultures and where we're at today is we're trying to trick the universe into giving us things that we think we're meant to have. And that's where social media has played a huge role. And all of that programming it's telling us that in order for us to be happy or successful, we need to have all of these things that everyone else has. But in reality, we have all the things that we're meant to have that we're going to receive and are going to unfold as we continue this journey. But in relationship, in Tantra, for example, you're building that energy. So a soul's divine plan can manifest in many different vibrations. We can have a lower vibrational experience of that plan, or we can cultivate a higher expression of it. And I think that was really the devotion of couples in those times, was they were coming together to share masculine and feminine energy with each other, to find that neutrality and build that energy so that as a couple, as a family, as a community, everyone was abundant and prosperous, because ultimately we all come to be that. We just fall off the wagon when we feel like we're alone and we have to work really hard to do it. So we're kind of being taught that we need to work really hard and get on the trail of forcing this kind of, material future, when in fact, if we would go back to the spiritual principles that we've been taught, which really are becoming very erased today, deliberately, we wouldn't have to worry about it so much.
Yeah, I agree with that. And these are topics that I've explored a lot in my own personal journey, and I tend to look at things in a very grounded, practical perspective, and often using cycles as a guide or a map. And in my years of studying astrological charts and relationship interactions between two people, I have found that, for example, if somebody, and the astrology chart and the numerology as an example, I see them as what Micheila often channels as containers. So a particular container may have, let's say, um, financial difficulty. And let's say that container shows a period of time where a person may have financial difficulty or limitation. That doesn't necessarily mean that they have no money. What it means is that they may have that experience and in some degree or another. So, and this is something I'll explore on more when I start doing more of the instructional videos on the whiteboard. It's a little ways off still, but just to address the high level concept here, that um, there's a difference between the experience of having money or not having money and the physical result of having it or not. So, for example, even the billionaires of the world have numerology and astrology cycles that occur from time to time where they're struggling financially. And as an outsider, we look at their experience and we think, well, they're billionaires. They can't possibly ever have that. But from a cycle standpoint, it does happen. And what that would show up as is, well, maybe in a particular year or period of time, they have a business or that goes bankrupt, or maybe they don't make as much money at something as they normally would. Meanwhile, they have all this wealth, so it doesn't really matter in terms of their lifestyle, which is unaffected. But there may be a period of time where they're experiencing lack or they're experiencing financial restriction because of things that they're focused on in their life that may be struggling financially. And so in that sense, they have that experience which is in that container of the cycles. And so if you take that same planetary alignment and you apply it to somebody who may not have a lot of money, for example, they may experience it because, well, they can't pay their bills or they can't afford their mortgage or something like that. And so it looks more legitimate or as a real challenge for somebody who doesn't have the money or the wealth than it looks to somebody who's the billionaire. But the thing is, the experience is the same. So ultimately, it's about the experiences that we're having around certain things and not actually the physical, tangible manifestation of it. So from that standpoint, I believe from my years of studying these things that it's possible for anyone to become financially wealthy or well off, even people who have astrology charts that may be in opposition to that. So let's say you were born with financial difficulty in your cycles or in your astrology chart, for example, doesn't necessarily mean that you will end up broke for your entire life. But it does mean that that's a challenge you're going to experience as part of the container of this human journey. But there's a difference that I will again explain in future videos between having cash flow or income and having wealth. Wealth, I find, doesn't necessarily have to do with the astrological chart and its expression. So you can be a billionaire and still struggle financially in a particular year because the things that you're focused on are not doing well. I mean, we know plenty of billionaires who have businesses that are going bankrupt or that have gone bankrupt, but at the end of the day, it doesn't affect them in their personal life in any way because they're still worth billions. So in the same way, you can apply that to your own experience. You can have a very substantial financial cushion for you and your life, without it being something that's in your astrology chart one way or another. So, but at the end of the day, I do think that the issue is not really about the money itself. It's about money being the focus or the importance. And as Micheila said, we all end up having what we need to have. So there's no reason to worry about those things. But sometimes the worry is part of the journey of the cycles that we just came here to experience. Because as human beings, emotions are some of the things that we wanted to experience in this life. And of course, once we are here and we're experiencing those difficult emotions, we don't really want to experience them. But imagine, and I, really try to pay attention to this myself, that whether it's a positive emotion or a negative one, I remind myself that I came here to experience what it was like to be in this physical dimension as a human being with emotions. And from that context, all emotions are good. So even if there's any kind of a negative emotion or even a neutral emotion, I look at that as a positive and something that I should be excited about. And so I more and more often experience emotions, even negative ones, as something that's exciting and something for me to observe myself experiencing, as opposed to losing myself in the emotion itself. So I think that's a really valuable thing to start becoming more conscious of, being self-aware of what you're feeling and getting excited for the feelings that you're having, because those are all important things that we came here to have in this life. Another thing that I observed over the years studying relationship charts is that when you come together with another partner, and Micheila was talking about Tantra and that sacred masculine feminine union that occurs between two people. But you can see a lot of that in the astrological alignment. So if you are with a particular partner and you put the two charts together, you can see how the two people affect each other. And I found that, for example, if one person may not have particularly strong influences for money, and the other person may not either, but when you put your charts together they bring this third reality into form, which is their relationship. And in that interaction between their two charts, they actually are meant to be very wealthy or very well off. And as long as they stay together, they will continue to be successful. And I've studied a lot of famous couples and observe their careers and how their charts interact. And sometimes two people come together and their alignments are very strong for success and achievement and wealth. And while they're together, both of their careers take off or they become famous and very accomplished. And then if they break up or get divorced, all of a sudden you'll see a falling apart of their careers or financial disasters and so on. So that union between male and female energy, or really it doesn't have to be male and female, it could really be any kind of relationship that's a committed, close relationship, even a business partnership, can bring about certain qualities. Sometimes the qualities between the two people can be very good for what you're trying to accomplish. So in a relationship, for example, money may not be the main thing you're trying to achieve. Maybe, in a romantic relationship, it could be love or warmth and affection, and money may be a factor because you need that, but it doesn't have to be a primary factor. Whereas in a business partnership, maybe money is one of the most important things, and so you want to have that as one of the most significant interactions that are positive between two people. So I do think that what you're born with as an experience, and if you, as Micheila touched on, if you decide, well, if our path is already set in motion, we're always going to have, and like the guide said, we already come into this world with everything we need, and everything we need is given to us as we go, well, then why bother striving for anything? And that is true to an extent, I think, because I do think there's no reason to worry that we're going to end up in the wrong place or not have enough money or whatever resources we need to accomplish what we came here to do. We don't need to worry about that because those things are already orchestrated and they'll be there when we need them. But at the same time, the striving for those things is why we came here. So even if it's not about striving in order to achieve a certain income or a relationship or whatever, because those things, if we're meant to be in a particular relationship at a certain point in our life, it's going to just fall into place and the right person's going to show up that matches our consciousness at that time. But meanwhile, it's not that outcome that's the goal, but it's the journey to that place. I think that's something that we in our modern society give no weight to. And I'm speaking from experience because when I was younger, I was that person who had a goal list of, for every year, and I was working to accomplish these goals and had professional coaches I worked with to make sure I accomplished those goals. But I've realized that it's not really the goal that's the point. It's the journey to the goal that's the point. Because no sooner than we achieve that goal, we're done with it and we're moving on to the next goal or the next thing that we want out of life. And meanwhile, we're missing the process that we went through to achieve that thing and that experience that we gained that in the process of getting there, that goal or that outcome, whether it be the relationship or the house or the whatever, is just simply something that we look at that gives us the reason and the purpose and the direction to go in while we're accomplishing and learning and growing in all of those ways to become that thing that we're trying to move toward. And as soon as we get there, we're then moving on to the next thing. So the reason for achieving things, as that even though those things are already going to be ours because that's the life we chose, is not to achieve those things, but it is to use those things as a direction to head toward. And the purpose is actually the experience that we're having in order to get to that place. And that experience may be learning new things or changing our way of being or thinking a certain way or whatever that may be. Because at the end of this life journey, you can't take those physical things with you that you accomplished, but you do take the experience that you gained or the relationships you had and what love or communion you shared with those other people that you met along the way in the process of getting to that end result or goal that you're trying to accomplish. So I think that's really what we should keep more of our focus on is how are we getting from here to there? Did we struggle and suffer and kick and scream on the way to that outcome? Or did we enjoy the journey and did we appreciate the emotions even when they're very negative? And or maybe we experienced fear instead of experiencing fear as this dark place that we don't want to be, realize that fear was just another emotion we came here to experience and we thought it would be something that we really wanted to do. And so we can look at fear as something that's interesting and something that's exciting to observe while we're having those emotions, then it completely changes the perspective that of the journey that we're going through to get from here to wherever we're getting to. Does that make any sense in the context of what you're talking about?
Yeah. I kind of want to play off this, the concept that you brought in about the astrology charts of a couple coming together and either supporting, financially or some way else. That really kind of begs the question, like, how are we going after relationships and what are we trying to accomplish and what have we been taught about what relationship is meant to be? So I'm sure in ancient civilizations, they were using, these astrological understandings and certainly working with the energy of relationship to have the partner come in that was suitable for them. And the guides always talk about soul contracts, and we have many. So we have, all kinds of soul contracts, whether it's with intimate partners or family members, but they're never for one thing. So there's this kind of interesting wave of vibration that we carve out, and it's our divine plan. And we're interfacing with that. So how we perceive the plan, how we perceive our daily experience is lifting the vibration of it to a certain degree. And then we're drawing things in that fit really perfectly, kind of like a puzzle piece. So if we have a vision board, and, as we were talking about in the last interview, and we're putting a list of criteria for our next partner and focusing on that, are we really going off track of where the most beneficial partner could come in and give us the experience we need, even if it's karmic? And so the guides play with karma a lot too, as really not something negative, but it's something that's pre-planned in an evolutionary sense to help us grow and to help us expand and self-realize. And if we miss out on those opportunities, then we definitely we're going to come back and do them again, But even thinking about growing up in the 60s and 70s and the types of relationships that our parents had, which I think for the most part were really focused on these idealistic kind of societal goals and viewpoints of, definitely better family unit in terms of those types of beliefs, but looking at things that were a little more materialistic. And I think our generation is really kind of breaking that norm of relationship and what it's meant to be again, and coming back in a certain way that we're more transparent, more open, more spiritually aligned. And it's all about transparency and 100% raw honesty. Because I get this so much in session when people are struggling in relationship. They know that they're not working in the same level of consciousness as their partner, or they might be banging their head up against the wall because they think, this isn't working out for us. But they've grown so much within, and they've changed so much internally, that the guides will come in and ask, have you allowed that partner to see you fully? Even if it hurts, even if it's uncomfortable, these are the types of conversations that we have to move the contract along, to change it. And we don't know. I had an interesting channeling from, I think it was Mary Magdalene, who was talking about new partners coming in. And she says, we don't know how long a contract is meant to last and what it's supposed to bring to us. We may be striving for a new partner or a new love, but the person that we're with can become who we've always dreamed, we wanted to be with. And or could walk out at the exact time that a new one walks in. We have no idea. So what I'm getting at here is presence. There's the free will creation. It takes place in the present moment. We can't be in the past. We can't be in the future. We have to expose ourselves fully. And I think that's truly what they did in ancient civilizations, and that's why I think spiritual practice was the norm, because in order to work with that much emotion, like you're talking about, you have to be pretty grounded and centered and able to handle consciously the conversations that evolve when those emotions arise. I think that's kind of the new relationship, right? That's coming in. At least that's what I've experienced with you. And I know, in talking to many others, the twin flame concept, or the soul partner that is willing to have those uncomfortable conversations and not hide the truth of what's going on or how we're feeling. And that allows everything to up level. So you're coming in to support not just the monetary piece, but I think a more important evolutionary process as souls that we're all here to go through. And definitely take that experience with us. So in addition to romantic soul contracts, something that I've really noticed playing out both for me and other parents in my inner circle community, is challenged between generations, and children and parents going through major struggles right now, and differences in beliefs, and of course this all leans into the programming. And certainly I've noticed this propensity to blame the generation before for what's happened to the one after. And listen, we have a lineage of human trauma in every generation. So everyone's done the best that they could with what they had to work with. And we're all here individually. The buck stops with us, right? We're the ones who are turning it around in our personal lives. But the question is, how do we deal with it? Because there's a lot of heartbreak, and a lot of emotion around these, arguments and differences of opinion, and it can certainly be extremely hurtful. But we have to remember that we're all going through this major transition on planet Earth, and we're learning how to communicate differently. We're learning how to redefine family, and sometimes we have to walk away for a little bit and allow space, which isn't our nature, especially as parents, to allow that self-discovery to evolve, both within us and and within our children. But it's been a difficult period, I know, for everyone when it comes to family. And we were just talking about the extended family, the extended spiritual family, and another perspective on that is we need to kind of keep a little contact with people. And I posted in the Inner Circle group today about how I went through a little period with my own kids, and it was like walking a tightrope between ensuring there was mutual respect while also, setting boundaries, but leaving the door open a crack, because we want family members and children and people who are apt to awaken to some of the ideas that we are exploring to come back and to have those conversations with us. And I think we have to keep that in mind always. Permanently closing the door on things, it's sometimes necessary, but when it's not, and we don't get involved in the fight, we have this excellent opportunity to kind of blend realities and pull the awakening forward. And as a matter of fact, I just read this incredible chapter in the book, and we were talking about that too before the camera went on, about Pleiades. And the Pleiadians were explaining how their star system has evolved to become very multidimensional. So some Pleiadians choose a more physical experience in the fifth or the seventh dimension, let's say, and some have evolved all the way through the 12th dimension. And they tend to kind of form these clusters around Pleiadians that have the same intentions and excitement about, these choices. But the difference between that and Earth is there's no exclusion or condemnation of what others are choosing. And that's such a stark contrast to what we're all going through right now. And they say that the fifth dimension, which, we all believe we're moving towards, is a gateway to living multidimensionally. And it's where we get to blend all of the various access we have to these dimensions together into creating one really spectacular experience where there's millions of options. And that's what we're going for, is not this rigid one way of being, one belief system, but as many options as possible. So it's tough, I think, to navigate right now, because we want to form those really rigid boundaries and step out. And sometimes we have to for a period of time. But deep down, if there's children, family members, that we love, we always want to keep that door open a crack if we can, because I'm noticing little by little some changes going on the planet as a whole. And I think even moving into this next cycle, we'll see more and more awakening than what we have in the last couple of years, which has been a lot, actually. So I think the key in every situation, regardless of what kind of a soul contract it is, whether it's someone at work, your own kids or parents, or even an intimate relationship right now, is that we don't get involved in the fight. Because this being a period of war, what we're attempting to do is live the solutions. And really by doing that, we're fulfilling the contract anyway, because the guides say, we're not just here to learn lessons from others and have these karmic experiences. We're here to demonstrate a certain level of truth, to actually show them an opportunity for something that they may not have realized was possible. So if we're always doing what we believe is right for us, and especially if we are doing what we believe is right for the world, and we're living that passionately, even if we have to break ties, or connections with family, to whatever level or degree that is, it's always going to be positively impacted. That contract lives on. That thread of energy, it isn't just between us and another person. It's going to affect the entire globe.
Yeah, I think that's a good point because I often talk about that how, and I think so many of us get dragged into the conversation about all the drama that's going on in the world,
Right.
especially nowadays in social media. People are just constantly fighting with each other about their different beliefs or their different politics and so on. And so much energy is wasted on things that don't matter. And really, I think, although I think most human beings are in such a state that they don't realize that ultimately they're all just pursuing happiness, but because of the way our society is these days, I think so many people have lost sight of that. And so we're just fighting with each other over things that don't really matter. And at the end of the day, you can butt up heads with other people who don't disagree with you or who disagree with you, or you can work toward what you want to create in your life or the kind of life you want to have. And I think it's better to spend your energy and your attention toward moving toward something that you want as opposed to wasting energy pushing up against something that you don't want. This is very evident in the last few years on planet Earth, where so many of us have been pushing up against what we don't want, and how much production and life force and ideas and inventions and things could have been in the last few years that never came into being because people wasted all of their energy arguing with each other. Now, on the other hand, all of these things I believe are here for a purpose and there's nothing wrong with them. So what we're discussing here is not the world is wrong and it should be this other way, because all human experience is happening and is being orchestrated on our behalf. So I do think the last few years and at any moment in our human journey, things are happening as they should so that we can experience those things. So it's not about that. But as individual human beings in reacting to world events, we can choose to move toward things that we want or a life that we want to create or fight up against those things that we don't want. I see this even in my own life, comparing it to a lot of things that have happened in the last few years. I pretty much just went about my life the way that I always have and just moved toward things that make me happier and that are more fulfilling, even though other circumstances in the world were problematic in many respects and caused me to have to change directions. Um, so I think that's really important to keep in mind in your life, that we should always strive to focus on and move toward things that make us happier, and those happy things don't have to be substantial or significant. It doesn't have to be someday when I'm rich, I'm going to be happy, or someday when I have this perfect relationship, I'm going to be happy. It's the journey in the process to getting somewhere that really is where that attention should be focused. And then when you get that thing, that's good too. But as soon as you get that thing, you're going to move on to the next thing. When you get the perfect relationship, a lot of people stop striving for that relationship and then move on to the next thing, whatever that should happen to be. And I think that's where we need to focus more attention on being in the moment of the experience as we're having the experience that we're moving toward. And ultimately, whatever we make of that experience is what we take with us when we leave this incarnation. So let's say you're pursuing or you're striving for that perfect relationship, whether it is with somebody you're currently with, or maybe you want something better, or you're not in a relationship and you're striving for that. The At the end of this journey, you don't have that relationship that you achieved in this life, or didn't achieve, or were challenged by. What you have is how you went about it. Did you enjoy that journey? Were you more self-aware of the emotions you were feeling, whether positive or negative, in moving toward that relationship? Um, or And were you joyful in the process of the excitement of exploring those different things, of meeting new people, and that adventure and excitement and new things, and then you end up with that relationship or whatever it is you're working toward. We have to bring more attention to that journey and to that process, and keep our attention on moving toward what we want and not pushing up against what we don't. So when the world gets shut down and everybody's fighting with each other, instead of wasting our energy on those things, on what is being shut down and what the arguments are that people are having on social media, we can instead look over here at, well, this is what we want to do, and this is what would make us happy, and move in that direction. And at any given time in the world, even when there are major obstacles, there are also opportunities for us. But if we don't look for those things and we don't look for the joy in those obstacles, then we're never going to find it. And we're always going to stay stagnant, butting up against what we don't want in life. So I'd encourage you to take a look at that and to see where in your life you can strive for those things.
Yeah, I think by design, there's this overall depletion of energy going on within the human collective because when we have enough energy, we are not only conscious enough to both interact with reality and observe it simultaneously, but we don't get wrapped up in all of that, lower vibrational stuff. But there's a certain level of simplicity, I think, that you just brought to the discussion about life that I think is easy to miss out on because the problems are so profound. I mean, it doesn't take a lot to find them. We've got a lot of big things happening on planet Earth. So it's easy, I think, for spiritually minded people, couples, to feel as if they have to do a lot right now and bring a lot to the table to try to change all of this. When in fact, every single choice that we make, regardless of how big or small it is our contribution to the future. So even if that choice is making yourself happy in a very simplistic way, which sounds very selfish, I know, and I get that comment sometimes, like, if I'm doing something for myself, how am I being of service to the world? I think there's a balance there. We're moving into a period of time where we're realizing that all along we've been missing out on this purpose piece. We are here with purpose, and there are things that we are meant to bring to the world, but we are also important contributors to that in our daily life, in our daily reality. So the simplest things that we do that go against the grain of the chaos of society is contributing to peace, because that's the ultimate goal. We're striving for peace in our relationships, peace within ourselves, so that we can manifest a peaceful hologram and environment.
Yeah, that's a good point, because using our own personal journey of the last few years as an example, because a few years ago we were going in a particular direction, and we had, conferences, we had our expo every year, and our children's events, and so many other things that were going along just fine. And then all of the world events happened, which caused us to have to basically stop in our tracks. And so we So in some respects, we were stopped in the path that we were traveling on by the circumstances in the world that we live in. But now, I knew those things were coming in my own cycle, so it didn't surprise me that the life that I was living was coming to an end and something new was coming along. But certainly, I could have spent more time, or we could have spent more time butting up against all of those things and continuing to try to have events and continuing to try to keep living the life we were living then. But instead, we put our attention toward other things, like the studios being one of them. And so we created something new that we wouldn't have otherwise done at that time as a result of these external circumstances. So instead of beating up against those things, we put our attention on something that was more constructive and positive and a new direction that we could flow into. And I think that's always there in our lives, that if we choose to look. And imagine if all the people in the world today who are fighting and arguing about this or that or the other thing just simply put their attention toward something that they want to create that makes them happy. And I would suspect that most of the things people fight about, they're not fighting for them because it makes them happy. They're just fighting because that's just what's happening in the world today. And people tend to be focused on all of those different topics.
Yeah, I think what we can take what you're talking about and apply it to the microcosm even of relationship, because we've been kind of weaving this relationship theme throughout this discussion. People are going to change. Relationships are inevitably going to end up in chaos. You know, something's going to happen that we're going to have to address because we're all human. But if we flow with what's working, which we aren't really used to doing in relationship, we're taught to focus on the problems, and I personally believe focusing on the problems is extremely important. We can't brush that stuff under the rug. But I think there needs to be this balance. And, you know, we started this whole discussion with masculine and feminine balance. So it's really important to bring that balance to how we perceive what's going on in the relationship and not have to struggle through it or fight so much, but make really conscious choices and have conscious conversations that are very simplistic, but make a huge, huge impact. So I think that's really where relationships are going in the future, is not having to struggle with all this trauma, right? And all of the fighting and the discord that we've seen, you know, over the last several years and beyond, but not necessarily having the flow and ease of this very idealistic twin flame who's coming in, who, you know, we're not going to have any issue with whatsoever, because to be here on planet Earth, we've seeded some challenges in our way because we knew we wanted to be challenged. And I think that's the beauty of, you know, what's going on the earth, even though it can be really hard to deal with at times, is it's just challenging us in such uncomfortable ways to become better people, to become better communicators, to live in total alignment with what we believe, and for some of us to jump ship, you know, of some of the things that have been the norm for a really long time, and take a path that is, you know, less traveled. And I think that's really what it's all about. You know, this whole idea of the path less traveled is so glamorous. You know, we get on the boat and we take the journey on the yacht to, you know, a new destination. But I don't think that's really what it's about. You know, your studio example, I think, is perfect. You know, something that wasn't on our radar that we would have never done had something not forced us to take that route, is really what our lives are all about.
Yeah, to switch subjects a little bit, I want to talk about sexuality
Hmm.
because I think that's such a big topic and it's become more so as time has gone on. And I think that's another factor in society that's sort of thrown us off track in our relationships and society as a whole, because our society and our conversations have become much more sexualized, and it's you can see that in the media, of course, and with advertising and with different brands these days, but it's also very prominent in the shows we watch as well. In my earlier discussion about being conscious about what you're actually watching. And I think the problem, and today it's become an extreme to where sexuality and gender and these things are the topic of public conversation. And I don't think sexuality is something that should be a conversation at all, because I think your sexuality and whatever preferences you may have or in your relationship with somebody are things that are personal. They're things that you should keep with your own experience. It's not something that we need to discuss in a public forum or get approval from somebody for. Whatever you want to be, you should be. But I think these days it's become something that has become so much out in the open, and it's openly discussed, and it really has made this topic that is really more of a sacred experience and a sacred science in ancient times has become more physicalized and more corrupted in our society today. And we have to get back to, in some respects, a future where we bring sexuality back into the sacred and into the spiritual experience, and not something that's purely physicalized. It's become a public discussion in a soulmate or twin flame or a sacred sexual experience with your partner. Those are things that you share with that partner. Those are not things that you publicly talk about or share or have issues with that you argue with other people about. Where today, the more that we see sexuality, whether it be sexuality in films or sexuality in conversation today with all the identity politics and transgender propaganda and things like that taking place, the more it becomes public and the more it becomes something that everybody talks about and is in everyday discussion, we're moving farther and farther away from the true purpose of sexuality in the first place, which is it was designed as a mechanism through which we could have sacred experiences, expand our consciousness, and so on in an intimate couple type of relationship. And I think this is another part of the societal trends and agendas that are being created to disempower human beings. And in every respect, the things that are happening in the world today, and especially has accelerated in the last few years, we are being moved farther and farther away from our own self-empowerment. And whether that is by bringing sexuality out of the spiritual and into extremely the physical, to where it's an everyday conversation and an issue now that people argue over, or whether it is other subjects and other areas that we discussed today, the toxic masculinity and all of those things have become public forum discussions when they are not really the business of anybody but you and maybe those closest to you. So I think these are topics that we have to also start to change and start thinking differently about. Now, as it pertains to the relationships that we're in, yeah, and I think it's going to be a little bit challenging at first because we have moved so far in the direction of the physicalization of sexuality in our society that even in spiritual circles, the ideas of Tantra and sacred sexuality are so physicalized that nobody really knows what that sacred part is, but it's being taught today as if it is this sacred spiritual sexuality, which in most respects I find that it's not. So we have to sort of reinvent what we lost in the ancient past and bring that back, because in the discovery of that is where we're going to have really powerful sacred unions with partners and form really strong relationships in the future where the bond between two people becomes so strong that the state can't control the people. But understandably so, the state wants to move us more in this other direction that everything is going, because that's the world in which the state can control everybody and people are not able to stand strong on their own. So I think, in our intimate relationships, we have to start moving back in that direction. And it's not an easy thing to navigate because uh, what we're being taught today in many respects is not quite there yet. But I think we can start making some steps in that direction. And certainly some of the things that you teach in your channeling courses and such are starting to move us in that direction as well. And I think those are at least places where people can start exploring those things. But so, one thing I think that's relevant that I hear a lot about is, a lot of our audience is women. And it's just because, and I think men aren't quite at that stage yet to be exploring these topics to the same degree, although I think that's going to change in the future. Um, and I find that a lot of those women are in relationships with men whose consciousness doesn't match,
Hmm.
and they're trying to figure out, well, what do I do, because this is just where they are, and I don't feel fulfilled, and certainly you can't tell that partner who's not at that consciousness level or understanding, well, let's have a sacred sexual experience, or start this practice, because it's not something that makes any sense. And so, what would you suggest from what you've been channeling that people do if they're in a relationship like that? Should they move on and seek something else that's more in alignment with who they are, or stay there and make it work in some way, even though it may not quite ever fit together quite right?
Yeah, I think that's where the vulnerability and the transparency truly comes in because you have to push that line. And a lot of people aren't willing to push that line because it's so uncomfortable. And I can tell you that tantra comes in, sacred sexuality comes into a lot of my private sessions when clients, especially women, are asking about their relationship with men. And the guides will say, go back to this, because one of the missing links that we forget, it's all about the energy and the enlightenment, but it affects our physical bodies, and it affects our emotional intelligence as well. So we are better partners because we have the availability to hear and understand at a higher level, but also improve our physical bodies to be able to do the things, that we need to do even later in life. And sometimes that's the excuse that I get, or I guess the issue that people have, unfortunately, today is they're struggling with a lot of health issues. And the guides have gone in my last few transmissions straight to the nervous system and straight to the cells. And both of these parts of our body run on light, which is energy, which is breath. So the intimacy is key. It really is. And sometimes what the guides have offered in some of my courses in my session work is that just practicing a Kundalini breath yourself can be extremely restorative and healthy if you don't have a partner in extreme circumstances that you can do that with, because it is just, I think, the key to running that energy up and down your meridians, changing alchemically your entire physical and energetic structure. But more so, I think, men today are starting to realize, that they're going to have to step it up when it comes to some of this stuff, because unfortunately the women are jumping ship. They are leaving, or they're putting some pretty strict boundaries and conditions on the line. And I just think that's the time that we're in. The women are leading the way, I think, in some of the spiritual movement here, and I don't think it's meant to be that way forever. But the men are awakening to it as well. I actually, to be honest, have far more male clients over the last year than I've ever had since I've been doing this back to 2015. So it's definitely shifting.
Yeah, and I think speaking to men in particular, I think if you're not in a relationship currently, there are many practices you can use to channel your sexual energy into the higher chakras, and I think that's really important to do as young as you possibly can to practice those things, especially if you're not in a relationship, or even if you are in one, you can do it with a partner, of course, but so as not to waste that energy and that life force. And not only will it benefit you in terms of health and well-being, but it also helps to expand your consciousness and increases your magnetism and energy field as well, which brings a whole host of other opportunities and abilities that you might not otherwise have. So I think these are things that are not taught in our society. And again, an area where sexuality has become so physicalized in our society that it's moved us away from self-empowerment, where if boys were taught at a young age that sexual energy should be preserved and should be channeled higher instead of wasting it, or to have a lot of sexual experiences, which is what we're taught in our society today, that promiscuous sex is a good thing. But in ancient times, this was not a good thing. This is something that you want to treat as something that's sacred, that's not to be wasted, and that we should use it to cultivate a higher state of consciousness and an increased state of health and well-being as well. And it also gives us the ability to create things in our universe when we have a stronger sexual vitality. So so I think it's really important that we practice those. It doesn't matter what age you are, even if you are older already. Instead of wasting that sexual energy, to use certain practices to channel that energy upward and to expand our consciousness with it, as opposed to wasting that energy. And then it affects our health and consciousness and so many other areas. So I would suggest looking into that. There are some teachers who teach these things. Certainly, we talk about those things from time to time, and maybe in a future discussion we can explore that a bit more deeply. I do want to even have some channeling discussions in the future where we'll explore some of these ancient topics and try to bring back some of these practices from ancient times so that we can bring that wisdom forward and start moving our society into a future that has a lot of those positive, empowering elements from ancient times.
Yeah, this whole sacred sexuality topic even really leans into this overarching theme of genetics and our DNA, which is so prominent today in so many different directions. Whether it's the physical DNA, the carbon DNA, the patterns there, or trying to illuminate the spiritual crystalline DNA, and in choosing a partner and how you interact with that partner is really paramount. And I think that's something that's being lost on the younger generations when we have this over sexualized environment, is we're not developing this deep appreciation for the genetic predisposition that we have, and then sharing that with a partner that is equal to us in that way, or perhaps is going to enhance somehow who we are, or together will become something in the world, as a couple. And I really think that is how ancient civilizations approached sexuality, is by looking at it not only as this sacred tantric energetic practice, but as a blending or a merging with someone at all levels, spiritual and physical as well.
Well, thank you all for joining us for another show today, and we'll be doing a lot more as we go forward, and probably once we get into the spring, summer months of 2023 and beyond, you're going to see a lot more different kinds of shows, some that are like these, more conversational, and we'll also go back to our Flower of Life live streams that we do every month, and some private channeling events where Micheila and I will be discussing different topics like ancient civilizations and sacred sexuality and these kind of things, where the guides will have a opportunity to share a lot of these things with us, so we can bring some of that ancient wisdom back into modern times and actually put them into effect in our lives. And as I said, once the second studio is done, I'll start doing more instructional videos about how to apply a lot of these things into our physical lives to actually produce an impact on our physical journey as well. So thank you again for joining us, and we'll see you next time.